You came here because you want to know. You want to know why do we have a brain inside our heads, apparently, right? Um, what kind of brains are there? What kind of complex cognitions are there? So I want to give you an overview of brain complexity and in different contexts, which I think you'll find interesting. But I would like to start with the brain that we know more. It's more familiar to us. It's a lot of mystery there yet. And to help myself, I brought my brain, right? Right? So my family was very happy when I told them that I had a brain. So an important thing that surrounds kind of the mystery of everything we don't know about brains is the origins, how this amazing object originated. And of course, one could say that if you want to understand that, you should look into the fossils, right? And you could argue that maybe minds do not leave fossils. And that's partially true. So partially true meaning what? And I started with this particular picture, which is the cave of the hands in Argentina. Very spectacular. It's done by, we know, different individuals. But there's something especially interesting here, which is a regularity, something that is unique. Do you figure out? There's something that you say, this is a pattern, clearly. Well, you don't want to intervene, okay. But the thing is that all the hands are left, okay? Yeah, someone is doing this, right? Which means that whoever did that used the right hand to push the painting and do this. Which means that the asymmetry that we know is in the brain, because most people is right-handed, okay, was already there. So you can have a bit of a glimpse of neuroscience from something that comes from people that has been dead for a very, very, very long time. More interesting than that is, in fact, the caves where people try to paint scenes, sometimes scenes that have a time dimension, right? In Chauvet, in Lascaux, in the north of Spain, you have all these amazing paintings of people. And I want you to think in the following thing. Beyond the art, which is in itself is very interesting, the amazing thing that is telling is that these people were leaving a message, not for someone who was already around, right? It's a message for the future. It's a message for whoever else might come, including us, right? The message still propagates and comes here. So what was special about the human mind? Sometimes people discusses this idea, are we really so special? And I will defend, yes, we are very much special. And for several reasons. In this book that I love very much, The Gap, the author, Sudendorf, kind of defends this idea that we were equipped with a number of amazing innovations. Language is one of them. We have this language that has the capacity for using a finite number of elements, of words, to build infinite potential sentences, or even writing books and stories. One of the most amazing things, which is one of my obsessions, is time traveling. What do I mean by that? We are mental time travelers. So we can not only look back into our memories in very sophisticated ways, but we can imagine futures. Not one future, any futures. And we can imagine ourselves in that future. And that probably was kind of a breaking point in our evolution. And I want to point out there's no machine that exists that can manage that, right? And more things, it's kind of a long list. Interestingly, moral comes when we are kids. We know what is good and what is bad. Unfortunately, afterwards, everything gets distorted. And we have this capacity of mind reading, right? This amazing capacity of putting yourself in the mind of another one, someone else. Meaning that just looking at your face, I can know if you are sad, if you are a threat, if you need help in any way. And that probably brought other important things, like, for example, consciousness. So my talk is going to be about many open questions, right? As it happens in good science, we try to deliver answers, but most of the time we're fighting with formulating and understanding questions. So when and how intelligence emerged, and a number of things that could be discussed, but it goes beyond the contents of what I want to say. But the brain, it is amazing architecture that we know now for the human brain is 86,000 billions of neurons. Somebody counted, right? Not bad. It has the capacity of, I was saying, of seeing the future. We know a lot, but we ignore a lot more, in particular about how consciousness emerges. But we do know some things. One of them is that the brain is capable of generating amazing, what we call emergent phenomena, like, for example, consciousness. What I mean by emergent? Emergent means that I know this is made by many, many, many units in interaction, but if I spend my whole life analyzing single neurons, I will never understand what consciousness is. It's the collective dynamics of everything what makes consciousness and other things to emerge. So, this is a brain that is solid. In what sense? We'll go into that. But when you think in the mind, you have a long number of questions that have been, in many cases, not answered, right? Why brains? It might sound like a strange question, but if you think about it, this is a very costly object, right? Even the brain for a mice or for a very simple organism, it has a cost. Right? You have to build it, you have to maintain it. In our case, it's 25% of the energy of the body that goes into the brain. So, a legitimate question will be, why is the biosphere not made of bacteria that cover everything? Because this has a cost. But we know the answer for that. The answer for that is that this is a prediction machine, right? I use machine in a loose sense. A prediction machine meaning that I'm able to kind of foresee what can happen. I can use that to modify my environment. So the payoff for being able to do that is huge, right? So that's the way in which neural complexity emerged. But we go into more things. What kind of brains are there? Are there other minds of some kind, right? Is consciousness an emergent property? Is many, many questions that are around and have to do with evolution, how things evolve in time. And that brings an important question that I think is important to make. So how likely is this to happen? How likely is, imagine another planet, or imagine our own planet if we could rerun the tape of evolution. And there's people that have been thinking about this question, and this has been affected a lot our research in trying to figure out what kind of cognitions and brains are there. And one view of this is the view that thinks in evolution as something that is very historical, right? A process that depends very much on every single event. Stephen Jay Gould wrote this nice book, Wonderful Life. The title is inspired in a movie that you might have seen. This movie, which is, it's projected every single Christmas, so I've seen it, I don't know how many times. This movie from Frank Capra is about this guy. I'll tell the story very shortly. This guy is very, very nice guy, but at some point in his life, he feels like he has totally failed. He's thinking in killing himself, and he thinks that if I haven't been born, the world will be a better place. So in the movie, an angel comes about. So it's a very annoying character who is trying to convince him that he's wrong. But since he cannot convince, he makes this experiment, which is, okay, let's see the world if you haven't been born, all right? So he can see that, and what happened essentially is that if he hadn't been born, he couldn't save his little brother who fell in a frozen lake, and his brother who have died, and he couldn't save a group of soldiers in the war, and so on and so forth. So this event, not being part of the story, propagates into the future, right, in totally unexpected ways. So the point that Gould makes is that Actually, evolution is like that. Evolution is a historical process. If we were back in time and restarted evolution, he claims, everything will be different. We will see a planet as an alien planet. All right. But there's another perspective here, which is the perspective that myself and other people in complex systems take, which is that, in fact, there are very strong laws that limit the possibilities of evolution, that some things inevitably will come about, right, including brains, because this is part of the dynamical processes that underlie evolution. And there's, for example, this book, Life Solution, right? Sounds like a self-help book, but this is a book about evolutionary convergence. The idea that you find out that evolution has found again and again, multiple times in independent paths, solutions to problems. For example, our eye is a camera eye with retina and the crystalline and everything, has been reinvented at least 25 times in totally different contexts, right? As if there's one solution for this, right? So maybe there's more than history. So some years ago, I organized a conference at the Santa Fe Institute with this generic title, Liquid Brains, Solid Brains, in trying to figure out if we can actually go beyond these brains. Why am I calling this solid? The reason is, this is made of neurons, and once development has finished, the brain is built, neurons are going to be there, unless they die, in their locations, right? And everything interesting is going to happen in the connectivity between them, right? But they are essentially frozen, which is a problem, right? Because, I mean, people is talking about immortality, blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, the brain is not changing. It's decaying all the time. Since 3 years old, it's going down. So, we tried to make a map of this because beyond this, there are other systems that have cognition, which includes ant colonies, where you have a distributed system of many brains connected in a whole collective intelligence. The immune system that we have, the immune system is capable of having memory, to learn, etc. And they are both liquid. The components of the system are moving around all the time. And that makes a big difference. So we wanted to try to understand if there are general laws, if liquid brains can be as complex as solid ones, and what are the implications of all this. And of course, there's the whole side of artificial intelligence and artificial minds, right? Which we will also briefly discuss. Okay, so there are many things, and there's another way of looking at the problem. There are many, many things that you don't observe in natural systems. That could be, but you don't see, right? These are my drawings for 4 different cases. For example, we don't find out ants with huge brains. They are not there, right? Our brains, the brains of vertebrates, all the complex brains around, are bilateral. They have the 2 hemispheres. Nothing like that emerges. Or, for example, octopi are amazingly smart creatures, but they haven't managed to use tools. Or, for example, to build a trap, which could be, why not? And we want to answer these things. Oh, this is part of propaganda. Unfortunately, I have to say, this is the cover of a book that is not finished. So I have a cover, right? But someday we'll have something else. Okay, so why brains? What kind of brains? What can be constraining the complexity of these objects, all right? And I have to point out, actually, because sometimes, wow, this is a flashy thing. Sometimes people say, is the brain the most complex object of the universe? And it might sound like a tricky question, because you could say, well, our experience about what is in the universe in terms of planets is n equals 1, so our planet. But have in mind something that I think is really relevant. The brain is extremely complex, for sure, and no matter what, it's clear that he has been able to discover things like infinity. So we do understand the concept of infinity. You could ask yourself, is there anything else beyond that you can actually find out? So we'll go for several case studies, right, about what is there. and also trying to make a rationale for why brains, right? And how brains emerge. And there's this beautiful idea, which I'm going to use when I talk about plants, which is the moving hypothesis, meaning that if you are an organism that needs to move in an environment where you have to search for food, and in certain environment, having a brain has a lot of advantages, because the brain can synchronize the activity of the body, but can also integrate information from your senses, right? So brains were probably the outcome of something that happened in the Cambrian explosion 550 million years ago, when life happens to be a revolution. All the animal designs are invented, and we think that one of the engines of this was predators. Predators changed all the rules. And so, is the human brain and mind unique? We'll go a little bit into that. But to do that, we need to kind of look for the space of the possible, right? Which is still ongoing project. But one thing that we did was to actually try to make a space of possibilities where we can map different cognitive systems, right? Systems that in a way or another perform computations or kind of search in their environments and response to that, where you have three axes. One is how complex is cognition. Well, the other one is the physical state. We just talked about liquid versus solid. And the vertical axis is what is the role of building the agent, building the structure. So whether or not there's development involved. Interestingly, in this diagram, we can locate several things in the corners. Over there, neural systems. This will be the solid story. The equivalent here for high complexity development, etc., will be the immune system. But you can locate a lot of interesting things there. The microbiome, which is kind of a very peculiar thing, right? Inside our bodies, it performs some kind of computations. Insect colonies, as I put it there, are in the middle because ants move around, so there's a liquid part, but they build solid nests, right? So, also want to point out that there's an unexplored space in this cube, which says that there's nothing there, right? One of the things that my lab is trying to do is to see if maybe we can go there using genetic engineering, for example. So, how can we model cognitive systems? And one important problem that we propose is the question is whether we can say something about ant colonies, for example. If ant colonies are kind of a liquid brain, how complex is this? Is it something that can be compared with this in any way? Well, one good point of starting has to do with how we have been make models to understand brains. And Hopfield, John Hopfield was one of the people who actually make a big revolution within the area that predates many other things in neuroscience, and in particular, all the artificial intelligence wave that we are living now. I'll tell you about how the Hopfield model works, right? Hopfield is a physicist, so we were thinking about trying to figure out one particular problem that is very interesting, that we humans solve very easily, but is not at all possible to program in a computer in a standard way, which is associative memory. Imagine that you look to a picture of some friend, right? The picture is flat. It's not your friend. It's flat. Maybe it's not a picture. It's a caricature, all right? So our brain is capable of making a lot of inferences about what is behind, right? Very easily. And moreover, if, for example, I show you this caricature, and then maybe some years later, you're searching for something, and the caricature is there on top of a table, but half covered with a book, right? It's very, very likely that you still remember what is it. This incomplete information is completely recovered by your brains, right? Okay? So, what Hopfield did was the following. Imagine I have a network of neurons, which are going to be these little balls here, right? I put the network on a surface like a retina, And then I'm going to show the network different images, right? For example, numbers or letters, in such a way that when I send a white pixel, right, to a given neuron, right, this neuron takes this state. For example, 1, right? When I send a black pixel to this neuron, right, my state is 1, so to speak, right? So the network is placed in the state of what I am showing it. Then, how do I store memories here? And the trick of the model, which has a lot of really big simplifications, is, and that's all. If two neurons receive the same kind of signal, I reinforce the connection, right? If two neurons receive different kinds of signals, I make the connection weaker, okay? So it's no program, it's kind of very local rule, okay, but it's used for the whole system. Well, you can show that just using this rule, right, and having a dynamical model of how the network kind of changes over time, the important point is it can be shown, right, that in a space of connectivities, the network generates kind of a landscape, right? You can imagine like a surface with many minima, and the minima of this surface or in this landscape are the memories. So you store the memories, right, in this hyperspace. This is very much related with many things that we have now for ChatGPT, etc., in such a way that if I show to the network an incomplete picture, right, the network goes changing over time until it totally reconstructs the whole, right? So it has associative memory. It has the capacity for recovering the whole information from partial information, right? This is quite a thing, right? This was a paper that, in many ways, made a revolution in the area. So essentially, the idea is that we have a landscape that is created in this space of connections, in this solid network, and many memories can be stored there. All right, so that's the picture for a model of a solid brain. So what happened when I look to the liquid counterpart, right? A nice example is, for example, army ants. Army ants is a very important species that you can find in the tropics in many different places, and that have this swarming behavior. Meaning what? Meaning that if you are in the rainforest, it's very impressive to see this, and sometimes you know they are coming because it sounds like rain, but it's kind of millions of ants that are moving, making like an amoeba that is searching on the surface, searching for prey. And if you look from the distance, it's like it was a single organism that is kind of doing that, right? But the ants themselves are not very smart, right? They are blind. They follow chemical cues, right? Essentially, you have a system made of very simple subparts, right? That's the liquid brain. And so what kind of a liquid brain like an ant colony can do? Well, it's quite amazing because, for example, ants can solve a problem, which is the shortest path, right, between 2 points. For example, imagine that here in this side, you have the ant colony in your lab, right? At the other side, you put a piece of food that they like, right? So the ants get out from the nest. They explore randomly the two branches. One is longer than the other, all right? So when an ant finds out food somewhere, it takes the food and makes a signal, a pheromone mark, right, in the way back. So how do they know that what's the shortest path? A single ant cannot, right? But the fact that you leave this trace, right, and the more ants go there, the more mark you have, makes the decision. Because in the shortest path, right, because it's less surface, the pheromone, the chemical signal, the chemical mark, evaporates less than in the long trace. In the long, you have more surface, it's more evaporation. And essentially, the ants exploit a kind of a field that they create, but the field affects them, right? So that's a lot of the dynamics that is involved in this kind of liquid brains. So when we make models of ants, and that's an important point, you'll see why, we usually consider ants as having a very simple behavior, right? For example, ants can be active or inactive, like here, right? And they interact. Or maybe I can represent an ant with several bits of information, which can be zeros and ones, so that I can capture different potential states. All right. So the difference between the Hopfield model, right, which you probably know he got the Nobel Prize recently, with the lattice, where you have active and inactive neurons, is kind of rigid. We replace that with a new neural network where you can actually represent the interactions between ants as neurons interacting, like in a neural network, exactly the same thing, except that they are moving around, okay? So how much it changes the potential things that can be observed. And we found out, just believe me, right? We found out that actually, if you do the same model, the same models that theoreticians in computational neuroscience do for neural networks, remember the Hopfield model. There are many, many, many minima, the bottoms of the valleys with stored memories. Is there anything like that we find out in ant colonies and the models we can make? No. We have this kind of function which has a minimum, right? And it's a single minimum. And what is there? It's no memories. It's how many ants are doing this task, this task, this task, this task, right? For example, this was studied using a case study of ants that work in the desert in New Mexico, and you have ants that are foragers. You have ants that do nest maintenance. You have ants that do a task like being aware if something is wrong in the entrance of the nest, and they can shift from one task to the other. We can make a model, and essentially the model is saying that there's no such a thing as many, many, many different potential states. All the complexity jumps into how many ants do this or that, right? So our claim is that liquid brains are going to be, by definition, much less simpler in terms of cognition. So this brought something interesting, if you want, which is, okay, but that's what we seem to observe, that ant colonies are made of simple individuals, right, working together. Why we don't observe something like this? I'm not a Trekkie, right? I'm not, but I appreciate it. And there's this idea in Star Trek that we have this kind of hype with a queen, but it's made for a collective that is made by agents, by individuals that have big brains, right? Again, we don't have big brains, we have complexity in individuals, and that presents an interesting question that is unsolved, right? Most of the questions I'm going to present here are unsolved, so sorry. Oh, thanks. I've been told. All right, thank you. All right, it's non-alcoholic, right? So there's this interesting observation that we know that is called the complexity drain, that essentially says the more complex society, the less complex the individuals, right? I know you're thinking, okay, is this for humans? No, that doesn't apply to humans, right? As Edward Wilson said, as a society, we have nothing to learn from insect societies, right? So far, we'll see. So there's this idea, we don't have a theory for that, but seems to be a reality, right? So let me go into another example, right? Physarum, which is one of my preferred creatures. Can I leave this here? Whoosh, no, okay. All right. So let me ask you something. Will you be able to escape from a labyrinth if I drop you in the middle? Well, after some time, of course, you should be able to escape. There are some mathematical rules that you can apply for that, right? I'm not going to tell you, so you have to figure out. But imagine that I tell you the following thing. Imagine that there's an organism that is able to deal with a maze, with a labyrinth. This organism is blind, right? And it's a single cell. So how is that so? So that's one of my preferred creatures, Physarum. Physarum is it's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's a slime. It's a very simple thing. It's huge, right? You can find out in the forest. It has this yellow shape. It looks like a neural network in itself, right? But it's a single cell. It's a single cell with many, many, many nuclei. And essentially, Physarum does something which is quite amazing, which is spread over in space. In a way, it connects with how ants explore. And its morphology changes, right? So if Physarum is exploring a given area and you have a food source here and another food source here, the slime can detect which one is the richest one, right? And it makes these branches that are totally dynamical, right? That can increase in thickness, can decay, and get extinct. And what you will see is that the whole thing branches into the solution, right? Which is the good nutrient. And so Physarum makes a computation that has to do with shape, right? Nothing to do with us, really. So actually, you can do something more. Imagine that I want to do the following. This is an experiment done with Physarum. You can cut Physarum into pieces, right? And Physarum just fuses, making, again, a single organism. And it likes cornflakes, so it's easy to have it in the lab, right? So you put Physarum all over the place in this labyrinth, right, in this maze. This is the entrance. This is the exit. So these two parts, where you put the food, because he looks for the food and then increases the thickness from that. And my question is, can Physarum figure out which is the shortest path from entrance to exit? And the thing is that, yes, you can do it. So you put the food here, and if you wait over time, right, Physarum is kind of detecting the food. It sends waves, pretty much like will be in an electroencephalogram, right? You can see that it's pulsating all the time. You keep going and going, right? Some things will get reinforced, and eventually, I don't know if the movie goes until there, but eventually you have a path which is the shortest path from the entrance to the exit, right? It's pretty amazing, and people actually has used that for all different things. For example, imagine you have a map of a given country, you put cornflakes in the cities, right? And you put Physarum on top of it. Physarum will find out the optimal road network. And interestingly, sometimes it's more optimal than the ones that engineers design. So it has generated a whole area within computer science. And it's also interesting that this is the only instance of another kind of science fiction well-known character, which is shape-shifting, I don't know how to say, organism that appears in Terminator, right? But this is the only one who can do this, which also raises the question, why is that? Well, no more organisms like that, okay? Now, what about plants, right? Plant lovers, I'm going to give you bad news. Plants are amazing organisms, totally amazing organisms. They have really terraformed the planet, creating soil ecosystems and making possible the biosphere. In science fiction, of course, is the idea of plants that might be smart, and as usually happens, they just kill all the humans. But the question is, how intelligent are plants? Okay, and they have some things that clearly depart from us. You can generate a whole plant almost from any single cell from the plant. They are extremely modular organisms, and they respond to their environments by an amazing plasticity morphology. Morphology is pretty much the key of many things. So let me explain you a particular experiment we did, a computer experiment, or trying to figure out, giving a response to the question of, since plants do not move, is this something that might shut down a complex cognition, right? And the experiment essentially is the following. I tell you very, very quickly. It's a simulation in the computer. You have a given space where you have either, you can imagine like a grid. You have either an energy that comes from somewhere, the sun, right, for every place. You don't have to search for that. But also you have many particles of nutrients falling and disappearing. So you have also a landscape of fluctuating food, right? So imagine you make evolve some kind of agent, right, in silico that can either choose for one thing or the other, right? At the beginning, we put agents that can use both things, right? We know from metabolism that you cannot do that for free, right? If you choose one kind of source or you specialize in some kind of thing, you cannot specialize in something else because this is a highly costly thing. So you make this system evolve, and to make the long story short, what happens is you either evolve into an agent. Oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. So if you want to pick particles of food, you need to identify where they are, right? So you need to have some cognition capable of detecting things around, and you need to move so that you can actually go into the places where the food is more abundant. So it's a cost. So what we see is that this evolves into two branches. One is plants, so to speak. So agents that do not move anymore, do not see around, do not look for anything. And on the other side, you have these agents, like us, right, that search and decide, may have cognition. So the conjecture we have is that because of that, plants can be said to have very low cognitive capacity, right? That has a lot of implications and ways of reading that. Let me see. But before I go to that, one important point to make. I think this is essentially true, but there's a kind of an exception for the rule, which are the seeds, right? Plant seeds are time machines. Each seed contains a plant, but it's a plant in the future, right? That has to be built. And seeds have a computational capacity for making decisions. When a seed is dropped somewhere, if all of a sudden temperature rises, it doesn't germinate immediately because it can be just a fluctuation, a good moment. So it integrates the information. Within each seed, there's a kind of microcomputer that considers what's going on. And it's interesting that, in fact, the seeds are the moving part. Well, let me go into the other part of the story. What about artificial systems? Because a lot can be learned by looking at ways in which you can build the agents, right? And how far can we go? And today is a great moment, actually, to rethink a lot of ideas, because we are in the midst of a revolution, for good or for bad, about artificial cognition, artificial intelligence in particular. So there's plenty of good questions to ask, and this connects with the idea that I can model artificial life, right? Which is an older story already. Let me tell you a story. So there was a time where the engineers in Europe, it was 200 years ago, were building this amazing automaton, right? This is from Jacques Ross. Is a child that writes, right? As you can see, in a very nice way. Still working, so it's not like your cell phone that is going to get shitty in a couple of years. Still working, and he was able to write a number of interesting things. It can be programmed because the disks in the back, you can change them, and he could write different things, right? So the funny part of the story is when, at that time there were no rock bands, so the engineers were on tour showing the automata somewhere. And once they made the mistake to go into Spain, and it wasn't a good time because the kind of the Inquisition was still kind of operating. So somebody thought that this is an offense. This is an offense to God because you're trying to create life, right? Even intelligent life. It didn't help that the automaton wrote things like, "I think, so I am," right? It didn't help at all. So the funny part of the story is that they put them in jail. The engineer and the automaton for a couple of days, right? So, anyways. So, but if we go now into the new generation of what we call evolutionary robotics. So now we can use robots to actually mimic cognitive agents and use them to be evolved to make different tasks. And this is a beautiful experiment. You see why. It is a beautiful experiment to see that when you look at the cognitive space in terms of what can be evolved, right? A lot of unexpected things can happen. This is an experiment. I'll tell you very briefly how it works. Imagine on this surface you have some sources of, like this. It puts food, right? Where these robots, if I get there, I can recharge myself. But there's also other sources where I can receive a discharge, right? Not bad, very bad. So the robots at the beginning have red and blue lights, right? Which are randomly connected with their movement, so it's just tabula rasa, and they just move around. So the robots, over time, learn to detect what is good, what is not good, right? And more interesting, two things happen. One, which happens in nature again and again, is that they cooperate. So at some point, when a robot searches and finds out a food source, it sends, for example, a blue signal so that other robots go there. If it detects a source of discharge, it sends a red signal so that other robots are warned that this is a dangerous place. All right? Good. That's a good part of the thing. But imagine that you have too many robots. So I'm a nice robot. I go there because somebody make a blue light. But it's crowded. I can't get there, right? So another thing evolves, lying. So some robots start to send blue signals when they detect a dangerous place. So come here, come here. Or when they detect a source of energy for recharge, they send a warning signal like, be careful, this is dangerous, right? Sounds like very human, right? And I mean, the whole experiment, I encourage you to give a look to this. It's beautiful, very interesting, and connects with a lot of things we see in the real world. Also, sending a message, which is important. These robots are not alive. They're not made of living matter or anything. But evolutionary experiments end up in solutions that we observe in the real world, suggesting that this is kind of a very general thing. So, going into artificial intelligence, so how much of this is going to change our perception of how solid brains emerge, right? Many things need to be revised, right? For example, language. How do we acquire language? We acquire language in childhood. We have a childhood that we learn the language, which we acquire. There's no childhood in ChatGPT, right? It just receives all the cultural compression of information, right? To kind of by imitating neural networks, right? In order to compress information. There's many things that have happened. This is an old slide. I never have imagined that this for 6 or 7 years ago, that things will go so fast. This is a neural network that learned by just looking at paintings, so for example, from Van Gogh, learn to gather the style, and then you give to the neural network a picture of some place, and it reinterprets this as Van Gogh did, right? Who will say that this will be possible. Of course, there's many things that we have to have in mind, right? The current state of artificial intelligence is very, very far, no matter what people says, of a conscious one, right? Very far. And there's a very huge amount of things that for us is very natural. For example, in perceiving art and making this art something that suggests ideas that go outside rationality. And of course, artificial intelligence is very far from that. I want to point out language, because language is some part of this requirement to understand how the cognitive space emerges, in particular for humans, right? Language is very complex, right? Has been brought many times also into the science fiction, as in The Arrival. And how do we deal with that? This is the biggest problem to understand. And one interesting possibility is that we cannot go back in time to see how language emerged, but we can use robots. I'm going to tell the story very quickly. You have two robots that have vision. They can look around, identify objects or actions, and they invent a word. This is all programmed, right? They invent a word, and then this part of the programming is that the robots make a number of actions to agree. We are going to use the same word for this particular object, this particular action, right? So there's a nice experiment. At the end of the experiment, something happened which is kind of reasonable, which is the robots end up with a lexicon to refer to objects and actions, right? The unexpected thing was that when they analyzed the structure of this set of words, it was not just a set of words. They made a network. Because the robots, as part of the evolution of the system, invented a proto-grammar. So grammar is one of the key things that we don't understand yet how it emerges, but they did create a proto-grammar. Why is that? Because the thing is that if I see, for example, a blue ball rolling from left to the right, in relation with my body, I cannot capture that just with separated words. I need to connect them to say how the action connects with something else. And another thing, which is a long story, but is quite fascinating, is that this has to do with embodiment. If you do this as a simulation with no body, no real body, that doesn't happen, right? You need the body. Embodiment is very important, as we are learning every single day, not just the brain. So, how to define a cognition space? And that brings again into the current state of the art for artificial intelligence, right? Interesting, ChatGPT and other networks that are being used essentially were known more than 30 years ago, except that we now have the computer power for training them and making them huge. Is there something like consciousness or emotions or anything like that going to emerge? I make the point because one interesting thing that happens, even for me, which I'm a skeptic in many ways about what can happen, ChatGPT, as you probably know, essentially emerges from an algorithm that tries to find out what is the next word. Right? You have a text, what's the next word? Something that people have been exploring in computer science for many years. The amazing thing is that when you implement that with a neural network, so again, trying to imitate kind of the networks we have in our minds, ChatGPT, or the network, in the changes in the optimization, discovers reasoning. Reasoning is helpful to know what's the next word, right? Which is pretty amazing. And you have tried ChatGPT, you probably agree with me. Nevertheless, with one of my colleagues, Luis Seoane, we made the conjecture that to get into the general intelligence, right, to the intelligence that is here, right, you need probably to go into the evolutionary steps that brought us here. We made the argument that you need language, you need time, right, and I want to insist, time is not in any machine, right? There's no understanding of that. And in other pieces of the puzzle that are needed to really go into a human-like, or if you want, a complex mind. In our work, we tried also again to make a space of cognitions, right? That's our big project that's still in process. Again, trying to look into artificial and living systems, taking into account to what extent interactions are important, to what extent, how complex can things be, right? And this is a measure of how versatile is a given agent in different environments to solve problems, autonomy, right? We have a wall, which is the wall of life, right? We have agents that are capable of doing all kinds of interesting things and huge autonomy, right? A lot of things here about robots, artificial systems in this part, and it's a big empty space, again, right? A space that we don't know what is there, and we don't know if we can access to that. Just to finish, any guess? What is this? This can be seen from space, right? This was built when the Egyptians were building the pyramids of Giza. It was found quite interesting in recent times in Brazil. It covers an area which is estimated about the area of the United Kingdom. It's made of millions of these mounds. And these mounds were generated by termites. Termites that built a huge network behind us, right? And were extracting the dirt outside, making this amazing kind of set of pyramids, if you want, right? So here you have a different view, right? Here's a human. Okay. So it's quite amazing. It's millions of mounds. It's estimated that it's about 60,000 pyramids of Egypt that have been gone out, all right? It gives you an idea that of the power of collective intelligence, right? And I mentioned this here because it's interesting, in fact, let me put here, this is a paper that describes that. It's interesting, in fact, that we have been, unfortunately for the planet, we have been transforming everything because we are a species that, along with everything I was mentioning before, we have what's called the extended mind. So we are able to intervene and change our environments to make them the way we want, right? So in our planet right now is two big, what we call ecological engineers. In ecology, we call ecological engineer a species that is able to make a huge change in terms of energy flows and matter flows, right? Doesn't need to be a big species. Beavers do that, for example. But there are two big ecological engineers, humans, right? And then ants and termites, right? Which in terms of the total biomass, interestingly, is pretty much the same, right? But this is made from collective intelligence. And I want to make one point. People in astrobiology, which is a field that now is in explosion and kind of exploring everything, is making the point that how likely is to find intelligence in another planet, right? So there's one thing in the equation that has not been considered. Edward Wilson also said sometimes that if humans have failed to persist, this will be the planet of the ants. The ants will really dominate ecosystems, right? We humans almost fail a number of times. There has been shrinkings of population, and we are likely to fail in the future, it seems. So what about the possibility that we don't know? How likely is that the intelligence that eventually dominates the biosphere is made by liquid brains, right? The collective intelligences. But that makes a difference because an intelligence like ours, we eventually can build technology to communicate with other planets, but this is not an intelligence that's going to do that, right? So something to take into account because there's one possibility that can emerge. And that's all. Thank you.